My presentation covers three themes. The first is human nature. The second is relationships. The third is harmony. And then I'll conclude with a recommendation that we try and look at the world by seeing double. Human nature is one of those things that there's a lot of disagreement about exactly what it is to be a human being and to be human beings that relate to others in large group situations and community situations. People have different theories about what comprises human beings. And there are some of those ideas about what human beings are really different. So what I think is important is to understand that how we think about human beings, what our beliefs are about human beings, will determine the kind of social, political, and legal structures and institutions that we will build. So if we view human beings as atomistic, individualistic, competitive, warlike, people that need to be controlled through coercive measures, those are the kinds of institutions that we will build to manage our societies. One of the consequences of focusing on a narrow idea of what human beings are is that it determines also how we see the problems that we're trying to deal with. Do we see the problems of crime, for instance, as a matter of personal failing? Or do we see crime as a matter that connects to larger issues in our society that we have a responsibility to deal with? Every culture meets the needs of their members in different ways. And I think that part of the work when we think about justice, when we try and figure out on the ground how to manage conflict, that part of the work that we need to engage in with one another is what is it that we think about human beings? What are our beliefs? What are our values? And we need to figure out what are the consequences of the various beliefs and values that we hold about human beings. Will the assumptions and values that we hold enable us to create better communities or not? And I think that that's a test question that can be asked of much of our work. Turning to the issue of relationships, earlier there was a reference to looking at people in the world as members of our family. That's part of what I think is really important when thinking about justice or self-government or anything else. And there are two ways to think about other people. One way is to think about other people as an oppositional other. That is, we look at another person, we continue our own life, and we have no obligation to build a relationship. There's nothing in our life that requires us to extend to that other. That's one way of being in the world. There's another way of being in the world, which demands that we understand others as relational others, so that when we look at another person, we continue, yes, with our own life. We continue as relational and autonomous beings, but we also have a responsibility to build a relationship with that other. So again, this is another one of those really basic notions that can determine from the ground up what kinds of restorative justice projects or community justice projects or other kinds of work that community groups will employ. The third question, or the third theme rather, of harmony is one that is really important because it's a term that's used in a lot of the literature again, and it's one that's, I think, potentially open for abuse. And the reason that restorative justice raises a question about harmony for me is that most restorative justice projects require that the offender in a criminal matter take personal responsibility for the crime. I don't have a problem with an offender accepting personal responsibility for a crime, but I do ask, where is the parallel collective expression of responsibility on the part of all of the people around the offender? How does that collective responsibility be expressed? How is it acted on around people? So I think that it's really important for restorative justice projects to not just look at the offender and try and employ ways to make that offender fit the program or fulfill the terms of the program, but there's a larger question of collective responsibility. And I think that unless we make sure that we act on those larger questions of responsibility, we can potentially abuse the notion of individual responsibility. The last idea that I wanted to talk about a little bit is the whole idea of seeing double. Now this ties in with what I've just said about with the different themes, but it has to do with how we learn to see individuals and whether or not we're able to contextualize that, situate that individual within the larger world around them. I think that when we look at people, whether they're offenders or people who've been harmed by crime, or community members or family members of those that have been harmed by crime, that it's really important that we don't just see the individuals, but we see beyond the individuals and try and figure out how does our work deal with the individual before us and meet those needs, and also how does it understand and act on a larger perspective having to do with economic, political and legal imbalances, all of those kinds of structural issues that we know exist in our society and that we bump up against in our societies. Those are the kinds of things that we need to make explicit. So we need to connect very closely the personal with the political. So just by way of an overview, and I hope that there's questions about what I've said so far, I think that we need to work to deepen the conversation about restorative justice. I think that we need to be critical about the kinds of assumptions and beliefs that we say underpin our work. We need to challenge those assumptions. I think that we need to do a lot of homework at the local level to examine our own ideas and thinking regarding human nature, harmony, relationships. And I think that we need to look at, does our work not only recognize the individual, but does the work act in a broader way as to recognize what's around the individual and hopefully make those broader kinds of changes. I know that I've worked at the local level with the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en peoples in northern BC for quite a number of years. And we put together an initiative called Unlocking Aboriginal Justice. And with that project, what we wanted to do was to figure out how can people act from within their own cultural structures, their own kinship systems, according to those kinds of roles and responsibilities within the culture. How can people act from within those places to deal with crime, to deal with harms, to deal with both the victims and the offenders and their families? And I learned much from that experience, but one of the things that stands out for me is that it's really easy to write rhetorically. It's really easy to write broad goal statements about justice, community justice, responsibility, so on, those things that are good that we should be striving toward, and many, many people do. But it's really difficult at the very basic level, when working with human beings who are in trouble or who've been hurt, to act on those principles in a way that's consistent with the larger political beliefs. There's often a disconnect between the kinds of things we imagined we were going to do when we started and the stuff that we end up doing when we're dealing with the blood and the guts and the tears that happens when people hurt one another. So those are my comments. I look forward to your questions.